you tell the stories of what they're going through and the terrible injustices that exist under the effects of autocracy and authoritarianism, it can, like, those stories cannot coexist with a just society. And it beckons to us. It requires that we address it. It requires that we fix it. And it requires all thinking people, educated people, caring people to talk about how it is that they could improve that situation, whether that's in Russia or in Taiwan or in any other place in the world where people are not able to be the champions of their own destiny and make their own decisions. So my hope is that we'll start here in Ukraine, and by this time next year, we'll have an office open in Taiwan, and we'll tell stories from that perspective too. That's my goal.
I'm Benjamin Wittes, and this is the Lawfare Podcast, May 30th, 2023. Tim Mak was an NPR reporter in Kyiv since the beginning of the full-scale invasion last year. He recently stepped down and started his own Substack from the Ukrainian capital. It's called the Counteroffensive. And he joined me from Kyiv in the virtual jungle studio to talk about it. What makes a reporter leave an established news organization like NPR to start a startup in a war zone? What is the counteroffensive going to cover? How will it be different from other stuff you might be reading on the Ukraine war? And what are things like in Kyiv these days as the Ukrainians get ready for the counteroffensive for which the publication is named? It's the Lawfare Podcast, May 30th. Tim Mak on the counteroffensive. So, Tim, let's start with where you are. Every morning for the last year and a half, you have begun the morning with a tweet that's saying Kyiv is still under Ukrainian control. Tell us about your surroundings.
Well, so I've recently started a new publication called The Counteroffensive, and we just hit 1 month of age. And so we moved in, kind of by coincidence, into a new apartment in central Kyiv just today. So I'm in an apartment we just moved into. We've been carrying boxes, moving things around, and I'm looking out on a beautiful city, and the sun is setting.
Before we're gonna get to the counteroffensive, both the military one and the publication one in a moment, but give us a sense of Kyiv today. You know, a number of months ago, it was very much immediately under siege and under bombardment, even long after the Russian troops withdrew from the suburbs. What is Kyiv like today?
It's really bizarre, right? Because it's constantly under attack. Overnight, for example, there's a barrage of Shahed drones that came flying in and were shot down. There have been 12 air raids just in this month alone. So it's a pretty frequent thing. But then the flip side of it is that people just want to keep living their lives. And so I just returned from dinner. I was out on the street and I'm watching kids hanging out in the city center. I'm watching people going out and sitting outside at bars. It's a beautiful spring evening here. It's hard to square those two things, right? That hey, there's death and destruction all around, but there's also a real push by people. I'm just amazed by how adaptable people are, that even while there's this conflict underway, they're refusing to let it get in the way of fun. I mean, here's the thing about it, right? Like there's this facade of normal life, but I can also feel and sense and hear from friends and sources that the war grinding on for as long as it has is taking a real toll on people's sanity. And how could it not? You really can't get a full night's sleep because there are explosions from anti-drone rockets flying in the middle of the night. There are these big thumps that shake the room and set off car alarms, and you can feel it in your chest. It's hard to imagine that prolonged exposure to that kind of daily living doesn't have a long-term mental health effect.
So I'm curious, when you describe the explosions that you hear, the dull thumps that shake the room, what percentage of those are artillery or drone actually hitting targets, and how much of them are the anti-aircraft and anti-missile systems that the Ukrainians have deployed taking out stuff that is incoming?
Yeah, I mean the anti-aircraft air defense missiles, anti-drone missiles have been super effective, from what I can tell. I mean, central Kyiv remains largely untouched by the damage of this war for that reason. When I hear, and you don't just hear the explosions, you'll see the rockets get launched, and there's a streak of light across the sky as it goes to try to meet the missile or drone or whatever it's targeting. For example, last evening there were, from what I understand, dozens of drones inbound for Kyiv, and the Ukrainian government, which is not always accurate in its assessment of its immediate assessment of how effective air defense has been, the Ukrainian government has said that all of the drones that were inbound for Kyiv were shot down. And even though there's often reason to be skeptical of governmental sources, if there was damage, it always gets out through this whisper network, this social media network that exists in Ukraine. So I see no reason to doubt it. All of that is to say that air defense has been really very effective, and many of the bangs we're hearing is actually preventing death and destruction below.
And does that affect the sense of fear and anxiety that the explosions create? I mean, I haven't spent time in Kyiv, but I have spent time in Israel, where, the sort of the bangs of Iron Dome taking out incoming missiles are sort of strangely not that scary. And you would feel worse if you saw a streak and didn't hear it than when you do. And I'm curious whether there's something also weirdly reassuring about those thuds, knowing what so many of them are.
Well, it's hard. You do develop an ear over time for example, if you're in the East, closer to where the fighting is, what's incoming versus what's outgoing, right? You do get a sense of that really sounded like an impact versus that sounded more like the thump, thump, thump of air defense working. But what I want to emphasize, though, is that it's not, the stress is not an acute event. It's not one night. It's 12 nights this month. It's a year and change. It's the accumulation of anger and sadness that a lot of Ukrainians have felt over this period of time, and it's adding up. So, I watched today a video of Ukrainians cheering on an air defense missile going up into the sky last night and taking out what was probably an incoming drone that was aiming for some sort of target in Kyiv. And the person who was taking the video was cheering. And no doubt it was probably a fun thing and like an enjoyable thing to see. But what I think that video doesn't show is the accumulation of stress and worry and pain that exists in a war zone that accumulates over time.
Yeah. So let's talk about you in connection with that war zone. A lot of people who maybe don't know your name are scratching their heads right now as they're listening to this and saying, I know that voice. And the reason they know that voice is, of course, that you have been National Public Radio's voice in Kyiv since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. And now you have gone off on your own. So give us a little bit of the story of how you went from NPR's voice in Kyiv to the publisher and author and editor and proprietor of the Counteroffensive.
Well, just a very, very small correction, Ben, there. I was one of NPR's voices in Ukraine over the course of the full-scale invasion starting in February of last year, but I wasn't the only one, and I don't want to give that misimpression that there have been a lot of really talented NPR reporters in the country covering the story and doing really, really great work. But after mentioning that, I mean, I think the fact of it is that about a month ago, maybe a month and a half now, NPR had this big round of layoffs and laid off about 10% of the workforce, 100 people. And while I was not targeted in those layoffs, I did decide to leave the organization at that time and swap out for a colleague of mine who I thought was a really very talented person. And so that person got rehired, and I left the company. And what I was thinking at the time was, with very little money, NPR probably wasn't going to be able to send me back to Ukraine. And I really wanted to try to build my own thing and start a new publication based on investigations and human narrative reporting, really immersive stuff to put you on the ground, let you hear what it's like to be in Kyiv during one of these raids, let you feel what it's like to be in an Odessa jazz club when the air raid sirens are going off, or someplace closer to the front lines, embedding with Ukrainian troops. The goal of what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to do a different kind of reporting. So let me give you an example. Earlier this week, when there were these dozens of blasts in Kyiv, and they woke the entire city up at 3 o'clock in the morning, I didn't write a simple or straightforward Associated Press style story that said, okay, at 3 o'clock in the morning, dozens of explosions rocked the capital city of Kyiv in the latest series of attacks. What we do at the Counteroffensive, which is on Substack, what we do with the Counteroffensive is we put the news in narrative form. So we went to the Kyiv Zoo, and we went to one of the places where shrapnel had come flying in that was at the Kyiv Zoo, slashing through a tree. And we put the news out through the perspective of a sketch artist who was working just feet away from where that shrapnel fell and could have hurt or killed either humans or animals. We talked to him about his experience of the blast of that evening. We talked to him about what it's like to be a sketch artist in the war. He's quite ashamed of it, actually, because he had higher education, and really doing sketch art work, at the zoo was what little he could do to make a living during a very difficult time for artists. And as we read the story, you happen just kind of by coincidence to learn the news of the day. What I'm trying to do is sort of more empathetic style of journalism where we look at the news through the eyes of people who are experiencing it.
You keep using the word "we" to describe the counteroffensive, and I'm curious to what extent that is a royal we, and to what extent there is an organization or a real plural here. Who is the counteroffensive other than you?
Okay, well, firstly, I grew up in Canada, so as a Canadian American, as emphasis on Canadian, I think I'm genetically unable to use the word "I." And I've been used to. I've worked, over the last 15 years at a variety of news organizations, and it's always a team effort. So I'm very used to saying "we," and in this case, it is a team effort, right? So while I can brag that I've taken all of 19 Ukrainian tutoring lessons, I am not yet fluent in Ukrainian and Russian. I'm trying, not there yet. And so my partner is a guy named Ross Pelek. He's been someone I've been working with for a long time, and he's a brilliant guy who decided to move from Ukraine just a few years ago to London, not speaking any English, and just taught himself English. And he's a brilliant, very calm partner who seems to get more calm the more stressful the situation is, which is exactly the kind of person you want to be hanging out with in a war zone. So there's us. We've got a fellow in Washington, D.C. We have a copy editor in London. And one of our goals is to try to train Ukrainians. So I'm hiring. I'm trying to hire young Ukrainians, teach them how to do feature narrative, investigative journalism, and have them, start to tell their stories. Like, one of the big reasons we're doing this kind of narrative style journalism is because of the issue of Ukraine fatigue, right? Like a lot of people just don't want to hear about just what's happening on the front lines, or this unit moved from this town to that town, or that village got bombarded. I want to encourage both our writers and our publication be one to push out compelling human stories that would be interesting no matter where they took place. That you, Ben, or anyone else who's listening would want to read about the stories because they're interesting human stories. They involve, human emotions of for example, betrayal or anger, irritation, exhaustion. We're telling those kinds of stories. That's what we're trying to do. And what I'm hoping to do is hire Ukrainian reporters, teach them how to do that, to combat Ukraine fatigue in the West, to combat apathy, to combat cynicism about this war, to combat ignorance about this war. That's what we're trying to do with all of this, and that's the kind of team I'm trying to build.
So talk about the title, The Counteroffensive. It's super topical today because everybody's sitting there waiting for the counteroffensive. But it's going to look good 6 months from now. What's the theory behind the title?
I have thought about this, Ben, if you can believe it. I have thought about this, and I'm glad you asked me. Well, look, it's a counteroffensive, not just. I mean, it's named after, obviously, what we expect to be a counteroffensive and what may be a decisive moment in this war. But it's not just named after the counteroffensive. We'll do many, many things that may not have to do with the military at all, or any military campaigns or whatever. It's a counteroffensive against the things that I was mentioning earlier. It's a counteroffensive against ignorance about the war. It's a counteroffensive against apathy about the war. And it's a counteroffensive against the rising tide of authoritarianism in Eastern Europe and in Asia. My thought on this, my thinking on what we're doing as a journalism outfit to begin with, is that autocracy and empathy just can't coexist. That when you tell the stories of individual people and you tell the stories of what they're going through and the terrible injustices that exist under the effects of autocracy and authoritarianism, it can, like, those stories cannot coexist with a just society. And it beckons to us. It requires that we address it. It requires that we fix it. And it requires all thinking people, educated people, caring people to talk about how it is that they could improve that situation, whether that's in Russia or in Taiwan or in any other place in the world where people are not able to be the champions of their own destiny and make their own decisions. So my hope is that we'll start here in Ukraine, and by this time next year, we'll have an office open in Taiwan, and we'll tell stories from that perspective too. That's my goal.
Wow. So counteroffensive here is not even limited to Ukraine. It's you envision the scope of it to be in places where democracy is under threat from an authoritarian regime, or is there some other unifying principle behind what the foreign policy or conflict zones that the counteroffensive does and doesn't cover are?
Yeah, I think you put your finger on it. I think the goal is to tell stories of people and places where their liberties are being threatened by autocratic impulses or autocratic governments. Because, firstly, I think personal storytelling is the basis of, all narrative, and that's what makes us want to complete a story. Yeah, I want to write things, and I want our publication to write things, and our writers to write things that I'd want to read. And oftentimes that's sitting down with a magazine and reading a longer form narrative about a really interesting event. We don't really have that. We don't really have that luxury. We use a similar format in an email newsletter on Substack. We don't have a magazine, but it's a similar idea.
So what does it take, in terms of the number of subscribers, particularly paid subscribers, to be able to have the kind of news operation that you want to have. You obviously have to pay for your own life. You've talked about a team that you've hired or want to hire, and you're talking about expanding in areas of the world that are not necessarily as inexpensive to operate in as Ukraine. For example, Taiwan is, not the cheapest place in the world. So what does the revenue model look like in which you could actually afford to do this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Substack is a really interesting model, right? When I first started looking at it, I was a little skeptical of it. But it's actually really compelling as a way to do journalism, because it doesn't rely on the ups and downs of the advertising market. It's not, it doesn't include a nonprofit kind of charitable model where you're always going back to donors. It involves subscribers signing up on either an annual or monthly basis at $8 a month or $80 a year, and kind of giving them a little extra, giving them the right to see certain posts that others might not be able to see, or the ability to engage in a chat with me and Roz and other members of our team about what's happening in the Donbass region in the east as we're traveling out there in a car. It's hard for me to say how many subscribers exactly, right? Because as you know, being a leader in an organization, as you make more money, demands suddenly appear out of nowhere. Things fly out of the sky and they drop before you and eat up the money you've raised or you've managed to get from your business. I think the simple answer is more subscribers than I have today, Ben.
So it's fair to say the growth of the organization is meaningfully contingent on how many people subscribe, right? It's not like, when you start a big media company, you get investment capital, you get, you get some initial budget for your first couple of years, and then you got to kind of earn it out. Here, you're growing on the basis of sales, right?
Essentially, I mean, and basically that's how we're 1 month in, and what my pitch to people and to ask them to be paid subscribers is this is what pays for our body armor. This is what pays for our medical supplies. This is what pays for our gas to go report. There is a direct connection in a meaningful and personal way between paid subscribers coming and supporting our work and what we eventually put out on the page every week, in a way that is impersonal and wouldn't exist with a major, huge multinational news organization, for example, right? But like in keeping of the theme of empathy, in keeping of the theme of personal journalism, I want to be, I want to be accessible to our readers. I want our readers to get to know Ross and our other reporters as they join the team. I want this to be like a lively conversation between readers and writers in a way that wouldn't be possible if we had a huge organization or if I was still working at NPR. I mean, the concept for this all was that this is going to be my open reporter's notebook, right? That there's a ton of stuff that I never put it in stories when I was working at an NPR because it just didn't fit the format. I can tell you how I feel. I can tell you what I ate today. I can tell you what the culinary habits are in Kyiv and what kind of music I'm hearing or listening to. And I mean, it has the potential to be a really intimate experience.
The people who've never kind of spent a lot of time with overseas reporters do not, I think, get a sense of how little of their reporting actually makes it into the paper. That the experiential quality of particularly, war zone reporting and that sort of thing, but even any kind of immersive overseas experience reporting on a major story and engaging people on that basis, the percentage of it that fits the specific news need of the organization at any given time is got to be up there with the percentage of the Louvre's collection that's on display at any given time. It's some vanishingly small percent. And I do think one of the amazing things about the Substack forum is that it's basically just open to anything that connects the writer and his or her or their readerships. And, if you can frame it in a way that's compelling to people, that's kosher. And so you had a piece the other day, and I don't have it open in front of me, on International Vyshyvanka Day, which Vyshyvanka are the Ukrainian embroidered shirts. And these have become a kind of, kind of nationalist show of resistance globally. And so Ukrainians on Vyshyvanka Day wear Vyshyvanka. And, there are a lot of stories about it every year. There's a Reuters, everybody's wearing their Vyshyvankas today, and there's a lot of people post social media with them. But I did notice that you were the only site that I saw that had a kind of explanation of the sort of cultural role that the embroidery and in the specific context of this war is playing in people's kind of emotional pride in how Ukraine is performing, kind of resistance to there's definitely a cultural anti-imperialism to it. And there's a kind of quality of, Russians often dismiss Ukrainians as a peasant nation, right? And the Vyshyvanka is kind of a peasant shirt, right? Or a peasant dress. And so there's a kind of a yeah and fuck you quality to it, with reference to a lot of Russian prejudices against Ukrainians. And so I do think that's the kind of thing that probably you don't get to do on NPR.
Yeah, so like I said, in keeping with the theme of the way we do news, is I don't do the lead. Thursday was Vyshyvanka Day, a day that that Ukrainians wear their traditional folk shirts. We tried to write it from the perspective of a particular person, this woman named Maria Zarenska, and she's 84 years old. She spent the last 70 years making Vyshyvanka and also teaching children and other Ukrainians about the history and cultural importance of Vyshyvanka. And we kind of see Vyshyvanka Day through her eyes and what it means, the places she's brought her traveling Vyshyvanka exhibition to, and then, what it looks like in Kyiv. We just walked around and just started taking photos of every cool Vyshyvanka that we could see. And then on top of it, just to kind of accent your point about how there are just things in the notebook. I was like, there are a couple of things that are themes of mine. I really like hot sauce, and there's almost no sriracha in this entire country. There are millions of people. There's no hot sauce in this country. So I like to take readers on a journey to try to find hot sauce from time to time. I'm obsessed with Vietnamese noodle soup, so I'm always trying to find it. It's hard to find like kind of home cooked pho in Kyiv, if you can believe it or not, during this war. But I'm working on it. And then, today I was walking through the Maidan, that famous Independence Square in the middle of Kyiv, where revolutions have happened, demonstrations frequently occur. It's a symbol of the Ukrainian nation in many ways. And I looked over and I saw that someone was selling bubble tea there, and I thought, well, that I didn't expect to see that at all. And I posted about it. But having a Substack lets me talk about the on the ground, ground level view of what's actually happening in this war in a less formal way. And I think people really, really like that.
So I'm curious, you've talked about the stuff that you can do that you couldn't do at NPR and that a more conventional news organization isn't in a position to do. There's a flip side of that, which is the stuff that they have to do that all of a sudden you don't have to do. So what are some of the stories that will never appear on the counteroffensive?
As I was kind of thinking about the last few minutes of our conversation, and what I'm realizing is that there's a distinction between news and reporting, right? That if you work for a major news organization, you're going to be chasing what Zelensky said today at the press conference, or what members of Congress on Capitol Hill said after votes. You're chasing the news. You're trying to tell people what happened today. And that's important stuff. But reporting encompasses more than that, and it can tell all sorts of stories that aren't pegged to this happened today. And so what I'm trying to do with the counteroffensive over on Substack is to move beyond just that more traditional this happened today kind of reporting. As far as, the sort of stories that won't appear on the counteroffensive, I think what's true is as a much smaller organization, we're not able to take as many risks, right? I'm not going to be doing frontline reporting right in the trenches. We have a rule which I won't get into too much detail about, but I've set a rule for me and my staff about a certain distance that we're permitted to go, from the front lines in order to reduce risk. We just don't. It's just not worth it for us. There are huge news organizations that if someone got hurt or someone got in trouble, could spend millions and millions and millions of dollars to pull their people out of harm's way. Me, on the other hand, I'm still asking subscribers to switch to paid so that we can pay our rent. So we can't take those kinds of risks. We will go cover the war, but in a much more risk-averse way, I think, than I would if I was still working for NPR.
All right. So this is a conversation I could have asked you while you were still at NPR, but it seems more acute now, which is, to what extent do you consider yourself a partisan in this war? As in, you've said very clearly in this conversation that, certain types of authoritarianism are simply incompatible with, a thinking decent person's concept of society and decency. And yet, when you say that, you put yourself, it's very hard to then say, well, I'm a neutral reporter in the context of this war, because one side represents the free people who are just minding their own business and getting bombed and murdered, and the other side represents the authoritarian impulse that you've just described. And when you say, and then we want to expand to Taiwan, you're kind of replicating that. And so I guess I'm interested, what does the counteroffensive, how do you describe the balance of fairness, both sidesism, even-handedness with respect to reporting a war? You're based in Kyiv, not in Moscow. You're spending time with Ukrainian warfighters and civilians and civil society members, not with Russians. So are you on the Ukrainian side of this conflict, as I would proudly say that I am, or are you something else?
Ben, I've spent the last 15 years of my professional career trying to avoid questions like this. Working at big publications like.
Well, those days are over, Tim. Now you got to take a side.
It's like let me check with the editor-in-chief of my publication about what we should say. Well, he says, there's no way for me to say what I said earlier in the conversation and then turn around and say there's some sort of moral equivalence between Ukraine and Russia. There just isn't. When we talk about autocracy, I think it's pretty clear which side in this conflict is the autocratic one and which side is a growing and fledgling democracy that wants to become more progressive, more liberal, more free, less corrupt, tied closer with the European Union, tied closer to Americans. So there's no way for me to answer this question honestly, without it being very quite obvious where I stand on that. That said, there's a difference between that view and fairness, right? Fairness means being skeptical, even of those people you agree with. Fairness means giving people who are subjects of your story an opportunity to comment before publishing the story. Fairness has all sorts of other components to it, other than you can't take sides. And so I guess that would be my answer to this question. I think we don't have moral ambiguity about, for example, theft, right? We don't both sides theft or murder. I just cannot bring myself to say that there are two equally valid sides in this conflict. And so that's where I stand. It's pretty obvious, as you said, based on where I live and who I talk to. But I'm still very much interested in being fair, if that makes sense, if that distinction makes sense. I would also very much like to report from Moscow, but as you know, it's a very hostile place for journalists, especially recently.
Right. So I'm interested in the particular statement that you made that you still have an obligation to be skeptical. One of the things that I get accused of a lot is being insufficiently skeptical of the Ukrainians and the Ukrainian narrative. And I actually accept that criticism in the sense that I would rather err on the side of credulity and the cost of it be some wasted money, weapon systems that end up in the wrong hands or that sort of thing, than be so skeptical that aid doesn't end up where it needs to be in time to, say, save people's lives. So I would err on the side of insufficient skepticism. And that said, the Ukrainian government's performance over the last 30 years actually warrants some skepticism. And so I'm curious for your thoughts on the parts of the Ukrainian narrative that, from an American point of view and from an American journalism point of view, warrant the most skepticism.
I think it's really interesting. This is a really interesting topic, right? Because there's a really time-honored tradition in Ukraine of Ukrainians being incredibly skeptical of their own governments and each other, and so Americans kind of look at Ukraine as a relatively foreign place. But Ukrainians are the most boisterous, not the most boisterous, but they're quite boisterous people when it comes to politics and disagreement and criticizing their own government and criticizing senior leaders of important agencies. It's a time-honored tradition, and it's one of the reasons why Ukraine looks with great disdain towards Russia and what many Ukrainians view to be an entirely too unskeptical population, unwilling to demonstrate or go out on the street to push back against the leaders that they privately complain about. In terms of narratives, I'm trying to think of things that Americans generally believe that aren't actually happening in Ukraine right now. I did think of one, which is that Zelensky, for one, is lionized in the U.S. and there's good reason for why so many folks are admirers of Zelensky. But the funny thing is that in Ukraine, as you may know, before the war began, he had rock bottom approval ratings. And I was talking to this guy, and he's very kind of typical of the Ukrainian political mind, which we met in kind of central east city in Ukraine, and he's traditionally been a Russian-speaking Ukrainian, and he said, I didn't vote for Zelensky in the last election, but I've been just overwhelmed with pride and joy about how incredibly he's performed as the president of our country, and how much courage he's shown, in pushing back in these early days of the invasion and even until now. And then he pauses a beat and he says, "And I wouldn't vote for him next time."
Well, that's fabulous, though, right?
That's like democratic dissent, right? But like that's it reminds you of Churchill not winning re-election after the Second World War. It reminds you of what a free people is allowed to do and think.
Right, or George W. Bush having 90% approval ratings after 9/11, and then in 2004 beating John Kerry, but only by a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that there may be a conventional wisdom that Zelensky is an example of a perfect leader, for example, let's say, but he's a human like everyone else, and in Ukraine, he's certainly treated like a politician like any other.
So let me ask you about a couple of other themes that are, I think, really important in the American debate about Ukraine. One of them is corruption, and specifically corruption as pertains to the very large amount of aid that has gone to the Ukrainian military and for budget support. Should we look at that and buy the Ukrainian narrative that it is all being accounted for very rigorously and that there is no problem, and whatever corruption problems Ukraine has had, which the government does not deny by any means, there is a sort of national compact that the aid is not, particularly military aid is not to be trifled with that way? Or should we look at it and say, yeah, that's of course what they have to say, and there will be an X% bleed from whatever is given because that's the way corruption works in a society that has endemic corruption, much the way we all assumed that aid to the government of Afghanistan, some significant portion of it's going to disappear. How skeptical should we be of the Ukrainian narrative of this?
Well, I think the Ukrainian government narrative includes an acknowledgement that they do have some issues to clean up. But talk to almost any Ukrainian, and they'll be able to share with you some sort of story involving corruption. The thing is, though, there's complaints about corruption, and then there's winning the war. I've spent some time trying to report on corruption in Ukraine, and you'll call up someone who may have spent 15 or 20 years working on the corruption issue, fighting the corruption, making it their life's work. And they'll pick up the phone and they'll say, "I can't talk about that. I can't talk about corruption right now. Winning the war is too important. So I'm not going to address it until victory," which is, a phrase that Ukrainians often say. That even people who've made it their life's work to fight for this issue are reluctant to engage in it because it may detract from what is really the unifying force in society right now, which is fighting off this Russian invasion and winning the war.
And is that self-imposed, or is there some sense that it is, that this is disloyal to elevate other issues to the front of the conversation now? How much of this is just people are very united on this, and how much of it is social pressure or even government pressure?
I don't think there's any government pressure prohibiting people from discussing this sort of thing, at least from what I've seen. I think a lot of people are really, this war is extremely personal for a lot of people. Many, many, many Ukrainians, I want to say most, but I don't have the statistics to back it, know someone who has gone off to war and has not come back. It is really, really personal. And when you talk to folks, you get the sense that there are two reasons that the war is being fought. The first is the obvious one. Russia invaded and Ukrainians want to defend their physical territory. But the second reason the war is being fought in the eyes of a lot of folks is that they're fighting for a freer Ukraine that's less corrupt than it was before. And you're going to find a lot of disillusioned and angry people, especially young people, if the war ends and corruption isn't addressed in a progressive, and when I say progressive, I mean a gradual and ongoing manner that seeks to eliminate it entirely from Ukrainian society. There are so many people who will be asking, are already asking, what is this war being fought for if we're just going to return to the same old habits from before? That this war needs to mean something in a greater sense than just beating off the Russian invasion, that it needs to lead to a freer and less corrupt Ukraine.
So it would be irresponsible and reckless of me to close without asking you for your thoughts on the coming counteroffensive, particularly because you've named your publication after it. When is it going to start? And what precisely, which forces are going to move where? And what exact military maneuvers should we expect?
I think the click that you just heard on the line was the Defense Intelligence Agency joining our call. But
they are very welcome, of course. No, in all seriousness, since the specific formulation of the question that I posed was both stupid and joking, let me frame it a little bit differently. There's been a lot of hype about this. There's some of it is definitely has the air of a long-running Ukrainian psyop against the Russians. But it's raised the question in everybody's mind, what do we expect and when, which is, of course, the point. But since that question is on everybody's mind, what do we expect and when?
You know, I'm a former U.S. Army soldier. I was a combat medic, and one thing that I know for sure is that nothing quite saps the confidence of even the most confident person than waiting and not getting enough sleep in tandem. Zelensky has said that it's going to be some time until a counteroffensive begins. But I think there's already an understanding among Ukrainian officials that they've raised expectations a little too high. And that has impact not only on the military perspective, but on the psychological perspective of Ukraine's old soldiers. That to put so much hype around a particular campaign and its success, it's a greater hill to climb than go down this road 400 meters and capture that intersection, right? I don't know when the counteroffensive is going to start. It could be some time. But what I can tell you is that soldiers on the front, from what I can tell and from my reporting and conversations, are just absolutely exhausted. They're absolutely obliterated. That it's going to be a very challenging period of time for soldiers fighting on all fronts once the counteroffensive begins. It's just going to be brutal warfare.
Well, until the counteroffensive starts on the ground, you can read the counteroffensive on Substack. And needless to say, or maybe needful to say, you should subscribe to it, become a paid subscriber. Tim Mack, please do join us again. And thanks very much for joining us this evening.
Ben, thanks so much for having me on. I am a huge Lawfare fan, so thank you.
The Lawfare podcast is produced in cooperation with the Brookings Institution. Our audio engineer this episode is Noam Osband of Goat Rodeo. You are our publicity department, so tweet about the Lawfare podcast, share the Lawfare podcast on Facebook, subscribe to the Lawfare podcast's various social media feeds, make TikTok videos about the Lawfare podcast, and for heaven's sake, become a material supporter of Lawfare at patreon.com/Lawfare and leave a rating or review wherever you found us. The Lawfare podcast is edited by Jen Patja Howell. Our music is performed by Sophia Yan. And as always, thanks for listening.